In late September of 1963, far off the coast of Africa, a seemingly ordinary cluster of clouds began to stir. This humble tropical disturbance drifted slowly westward across the Atlantic, unnoticed by many and underestimated by forecasters. Technology in those days was limited. No satellites, no modern computer models, just the occasional ship report and basic weather observations to guide predictions. The system was tracked with cautious curiosity, but nobody anticipated the fury that was quietly gathering. By September 29th, the storm had entered the warm, energy-rich waters of the Caribbean Sea, where it began to organize rapidly. It was officially named Tropical Storm Flora. Within just 24 hours, Flora exploded into a hurricane, gaining strength with terrifying speed. Its first major target was the small island of Tobago, lying in its direct path. On September 30th, Flora made landfall on Tobago. For decades, this was believed to be as a Category 3 hurricane, but modern studies suggest it was a strong Category 2, with sustained winds estimated at around 105 miles per hour. For the people living there, however, such distinctions meant little. The storm unleashed devastation unlike anything the island had seen in generations. Thousands of homes were damaged or destroyed, while the agricultural backbone of the island, its coconut and cocoa plantations, were devastated. Vast swaths of forest were flattened, changing the landscape forever. The destruction of crops struck at the heart of Tobago's economy, inflicting a blow that would take years to recover from. The death toll in Tobago alone reached 18, and damages were estimated at $30 million, a staggering sum for the small Caribbean nation at the time. But Flora was far from finished. It moved back over the open Caribbean waters, where warm seas fueled its growth into a monstrous force of nature. By October 3rd, south of Hispaniola, Flora had reached its peak intensity as a terrifying Category 4 hurricane, with sustained winds reaching 145 miles per hour. Its next target was the mountainous and vulnerable nation of Haiti, where the storm would unleash its deadliest fury. On the night of October 3rd, 1963, Hurricane Flora made landfall on Haiti's southern coast with catastrophic force. The storm's Category 4 winds, estimated at around 120 miles per hour, tore through the region, accompanied by a storm surge roughly 12 feet high. This massive wall of water swept inland, destroying homes, businesses, and everything in its path along the exposed southwestern peninsula. But it was not just the wind or the surge that would devastate Haiti. It was the relentless rainfall. As Flora crawled slowly over the mountainous terrain, it unleashed an extraordinary amount of precipitation. The island's steep slopes forced the moisture to condense and fall, resulting in an unprecedented downpour. In the town of Miraguani, a staggering 57 inches of rain fell in just 3 days. Some unofficial accounts suggested even higher amounts, possibly reaching 75 inches. The saturated soil could hold no more water. Torrential rain caused widespread flash floods and deadly mudslides that buried entire villages beneath thick rivers of mud and debris. The destruction was swift and merciless, with eyewitnesses recalling a terrifying roar as torrents of water, rock, and uprooted trees swept down from the hillsides, swallowing communities whole. Rescue efforts were hindered severely by washed-out roads and collapsed bridges, leaving survivors isolated and desperate. The death toll in Haiti was staggering. Approximately 5,000 people lost their lives, a tragic figure that marked Flora as one of the deadliest natural disasters in the nation's history. The storm also shattered the local economy, wiping out much of the year's coffee crop and stripping away the shade trees necessary for future harvests, setting back agricultural recovery for years. Meanwhile, the Dominican Republic, sharing the island of Hispaniola, also suffered. Torrential rains caused the worst flooding on record in the country, leading to widespread destruction and an estimated 400 deaths. Flora's deadly reach had spread across the island, leaving a path of misery and devastation on both sides of the border. After ravaging Hispaniola, Hurricane Flora, though weakened, remained a formidable force as it made landfall in eastern Cuba on October 4th, 1963. At that point, the storm was classified as a Category 3 hurricane, but its true menace was yet to be revealed, not in its speed or intensity, but in its refusal to move. High-pressure systems to the north, east, and west created a meteorological cage, trapping Flora over Cuba for nearly 5 days. From October 4th through the 8th, the hurricane executed a slow, looping pattern over eastern and central Cuba, subjecting the same areas to unrelenting hurricane force winds, and record-breaking rainfall. The storm continuously fed off the warm Caribbean waters, drawing moisture and dumping it over the island in devastating quantities. Some regions were buried under over 100 inches of rain. That's more than 8 feet in just those 4 days. The prolonged deluge caused catastrophic flooding, with the Cauda River, Cuba's longest, overflowing its banks by more than 12 miles on either side. Entire towns and vast agricultural regions became isolated islands surrounded by floodwaters. The relentless pounding destroyed critical infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and communication lines, making rescue and recovery efforts extremely difficult. Cuba's agricultural sector was hit hard. The storm wiped out significant portions of vital crops, including coffee, corn, and sugarcane, severely impacting the economy. Damage estimates soared to nearly $500 million in 1963 currency, marking the event as one of the most expensive natural disasters in Cuban history. Despite the government's large-scale emergency response, the death toll rose to approximately 1,750. The island was left grappling with not only the immediate devastation, but also the long-term economic and social consequences of one of the most stubborn and destructive hurricanes in Caribbean history. On October 8, 1963, after nearly 5 days trapped over Cuba, Hurricane Flora finally broke free of the atmospheric prison that had held it captive. The storm moved northeastward back into the warm waters of the Atlantic, but even as it escaped, its fury was far from spent. On October 9th, Flora passed over Mayaguana, one of the islands in the Bahamas, with sustained hurricane-force winds near 100 miles per hour. This brief but powerful encounter added to the devastation Flora had already wrought in the Caribbean, reminding residents that the storm was still deadly. Caught in the prevailing westerly winds, Flora accelerated rapidly, moving toward the open Atlantic. During this final stage, the hurricane regained some strength, reaching Category 2 status, with winds up to 110 miles per hour as it passed southeast of Bermuda. The storm's tropical characteristics faded quickly over the cold northern Atlantic waters, and by October 12, 1963, Flora had finally dissipated, ending a nearly 2-week reign of terror. Though the storm itself had passed, its impact lingered for years. In Tobago, the destruction of coconut and cocoa plantations forced a major shift in the island's economy toward tourism. Haiti struggled to recover from the massive loss of its coffee crop, deepening the nation's economic woes. Cuba faced immense challenges, rebuilding its infrastructure and agriculture, further complicated by its tense political relationship with the United States during that era. Hurricane Flora's legacy was a stark reminder of the catastrophic potential when a hurricane stalls and dumps extraordinary rainfall over vulnerable terrain. It showed the world that a storm's deadliest power might not come from wind alone, but from relentless destructive water. The total death toll from Hurricane Flora is estimated to be between 7,000 and 8,000 people, making it one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes of the 20th century, second only to the Galveston hurricane of 1900. The storm's extraordinary rainfall, combined with its slow movement and prolonged impact, left deep scars across the Caribbean islands. Economically, the damage was staggering. The total cost exceeded $500 million in 1963 currency, a sum that would be several times larger when adjusted for inflation today. Entire agricultural sectors, especially coffee, sugar, and cocoa, were devastated, causing long-term hardships for local economies and farmers. The sheer magnitude of the disaster also pushed meteorologists and governments to rethink hurricane tracking and emergency response. Flora's stalling behavior highlighted the dangers of slow-moving storms, a phenomenon that remains a significant threat in modern hurricane forecasting. Because of the catastrophic loss of life and destruction, the name Flora was permanently retired from the Atlantic hurricane naming lists, a rare honor reserved for the most destructive storms as a mark of respect and remembrance. More than just a tragic weather event, Hurricane Flora stands as a powerful lesson on the immense force of nature and human vulnerability. It reminds us that even with modern science, some storms defy expectations, and their impacts can last generations. The legacy of Flora endures in the memories of the communities it touched and in the continuing efforts to better prepare for the fury of future hurricanes. In the roaring decade of the 1920s, Florida was a place of boundless promise. Land was the new gold, and The Florida land boom brought speculators, settlers, and fortune seekers in waves. Swamps were drained, canals were dug, and new towns seemed to spring from the earth overnight. At the center of this transformation was Lake Okeechobee, its name from the Seminole words for big water. Along its southern and eastern shores stretched miles of deep black soil, rich with nutrients deposited over centuries. Locals called it muck, and to farmers it was as good as treasure. Here, celery, beans, and sugarcane could grow in near-endless cycles, untouched by the harsh winters that gripped the northern states. This promise drew two very different groups. On one side were ambitious land developers and farmers eager to stake their claim in this agricultural frontier. On the other were the thousands of laborers who made the vision possible, African Americans from across the rural South, and Afro-Bahamians who crossed the sea in search of steady work. They formed the backbone of the Glades workforce, doing the backbreaking labor of clearing, planting, and harvesting. Life in these lakefront towns, places with names like Belle Glade, South Bay, and Pahokee, was a mix of hope and hardship. The labor camps were built quickly, often from scrap wood and tin. Drinking water was drawn from shallow wells, and sanitation was primitive. But for many, the land offered something worth the toil, the chance to earn a living where crops could grow all year long. Standing between these settlements and the vast lake was a narrow earthen barrier, no more than 5 to 8 feet high. Built from the same muck that fueled the farms, it was never engineered for a worst-case scenario. In 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane had already sent a surge over the lake's edge, killing roughly 150 people in the town of Moorhaven. It was a grim warning that the barrier was dangerously inadequate. But in the feverish optimism of the time, the dike was only patched, not rebuilt. By the summer of 1928, the lake was already swollen from weeks of heavy rain, its surface 3 feet higher than normal. The canals that carried water away from the glades were running full, leaving no room for more. The land and its defenses were saturated. All they needed now was a push, and far across the Atlantic, that push was already on its way. By the afternoon of Sunday, September 16, 1928, the Okeechobee Hurricane had already proven it was one of the strongest storms the region had ever seen. After tearing across the Bahamas, it roared toward the Florida coastline with winds estimated near 156 miles per hour. The storm reached landfall just south of Jupiter Inlet, its massive eye spanning over 25 miles wide. Residents who had not evacuated found themselves in homes shaking apart under the violent gusts. The first communities to feel the full force included West Palm Beach, Canal Point, and Belle Glade. Roofs peeled away like paper, telegraph poles snapped, and heavy rainfall quickly overwhelmed the drainage systems. In some areas, more than 10 inches of rain fell in just a few hours, causing streets to turn into fast-moving rivers. People clung to anything sturdy they could find as debris hurtled through the air. The hurricane's winds were only part of the danger. As it pressed inland, torrential rain began raising the level of Lake Okeechobee. The shallow lake, already swollen from a wet summer, could not hold back the sudden surge of water, driven by the storm's pressure and winds. Entire fields of crops, mostly sugarcane and vegetables, were submerged in muddy floodwater within hours. Livestock drowned in barns, and transportation lines were cut, isolating communities from outside help. By the time the storm's center moved westward across the lake, much of southern Florida was in chaos. Communication lines were down, leaving survivors with no way to call for aid. The full scope of the disaster, however, would not be understood until the floodwaters around Lake Okeechobee reached their deadly peak. By the early morning hours of Monday, September 17th, the full force of the hurricane had reached Lake Okeechobee. The storm's winds, still near 140 miles per hour, pushed a massive surge of water toward the southern shore. At the time, the lake was surrounded by a low earthen dike, built in the early 1920s, but it was poorly engineered and never meant to withstand such a storm. As the wind drove the lake's waters higher, the dike began to crumble. Around Belle Glade, Pahokee, and South Bay, the surge burst through the barrier with terrifying speed. A wall of water, in some places more than 20 feet high, rushed into the surrounding farmland. Entire communities were swept away in minutes, leaving little more than scattered debris. Families who had sought shelter in their homes or small wooden buildings were caught without warning, and many drowned before they could escape to higher ground. The floodwaters spread for miles, turning sugarcane fields and citrus groves into an inland sea. In some areas, the water lingered for weeks, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. Survivors clung to rooftops, trees, or any floating debris they could find. The storm's fury was so great that some buildings were lifted from their foundations and carried far from their original sites. The breach at Lake Okeechobee marked the deadliest phase of the storm, transforming it from a coastal disaster into one of the most devastating inland floods in United States history. Those who lived through it would never forget the sound of the rushing water, the howling wind, and the darkness that came when all electric lines were destroyed in an instant. In the days following the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and miles of farmland were buried under mud and debris. The floodwaters that had spilled from Lake Okeechobee took weeks to fully recede, leaving behind stagnant pools that quickly became breeding grounds for disease. Malaria and other waterborne illnesses began to spread among survivors who were already weakened by hunger and injury. Relief efforts were slow to arrive, partly because the storm had destroyed many roads and rail lines into the affected areas. The Red Cross, local churches, and volunteers from across Florida began organizing supply shipments of food, clean water, and medicine. Temporary camps were set up to shelter those who had lost their homes, though conditions were harsh and overcrowded. The state of Florida appealed to the federal government for assistance, and military units were deployed to help restore order and aid in recovery. Soldiers and volunteers worked tirelessly to retrieve the dead, repair damaged levees, and clear the wreckage from streets and farmland. Despite these efforts, many rural communities felt forgotten, struggling for months without steady support. The disaster also spurred a broader conversation about the need for stronger flood control measures around Lake Okeechobee. Engineers began surveying the damage and proposing plans for improved levees and drainage systems to prevent a similar tragedy. While these improvements would take years to complete, the 1928 hurricane had already left an indelible mark on Florida's history, one that survivors would never forget. In the decades after the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, the disaster became a permanent part of Florida's history. For many years, there were no official memorials for the thousands who died, and most victims, especially Black migrant farm workers, were buried in mass graves with little recognition. It was not until the early 21st century that historical markers and ceremonies began to honor their memory. The storm also led to major changes in how Florida prepared for hurricanes. The most significant was the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee, built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers during the 1930s and 1940s. This massive levee system was designed to prevent another deadly flood, though over time, it has required constant repairs and upgrades. The tragedy pushed both state and federal governments to invest in better warning systems and evacuation plans. In the years following the hurricane, the Weather Bureau, now the National Weather Service, expanded its communication networks, making it easier to warn coastal and inland communities about approaching storms. Today, the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane is remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in United States history, second only to the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 in terms of lives lost from a tropical cyclone. While the Herbert Hoover Dike has reduced the threat of catastrophic flooding, modern engineers warn that the lake and surrounding areas are still vulnerable if a major hurricane were to hit again. For many residents, the legacy of the storm is not just about destruction, but also about resilience. The communities around Lake Okeechobee rebuilt from almost complete devastation, and over generations, they have kept alive the stories of survival and loss. The hurricane's memory remains a reminder that preparation, respect for nature's power, and acknowledgement of all victims are vital when facing the forces of the Atlantic. In the year 1780, the world was locked in a conflict that stretched far beyond the borders of the American colonies. The American Revolutionary War had transformed into a truly global struggle, with Britain battling not only the Americans but also France and Spain. And while muskets cracked and cannons roared on the mainland, the true economic heart of this war lay hundreds of miles to the south, in the warm, azure waters of the Caribbean. These islands were the crown jewels of European empires. Sugar plantations, powered by enslaved labor, produced staggering wealth that rivaled or exceeded the profits of all 13 American colonies combined. Whoever controlled the Caribbean controlled a vast flow of sugar, rum, molasses, and money that could finance armies, fleets, and wars. This made the region one of the most fiercely contested theaters of the 18th century. By the autumn of 1780, The Caribbean was a loaded powder keg. The British Royal Navy, still regarded as the most formidable maritime force on Earth, sought to hold key islands and choke off French supply lines. The French Navy, having joined the war in 1778 to weaken their old rival, deployed squadrons to break British blockades, defend their own colonies, and threaten British strongholds. Spanish forces, too, eyed the region's riches and saw an opportunity to expand their influence. The waters between Barbados, Martinique, St. Lucia, and other islands teemed with warships, ships of the line bristling with cannon, frigates patrolling for prey, and merchant convoys laden with goods and soldiers. Fortresses and coastal batteries stood ready for siege. Admirals like Britain's George Rodney and France's Charles Hector, Comte d'Estaing, studied enemy movements and calculated battle strategies. Their eyes were on sails on the horizon, not on the skies above. No one suspected that, far out in the Atlantic Ocean, a storm of unprecedented fury was beginning to form. In an age without weather satellites or telegraph warnings, its birth went entirely unnoticed. All the great powers of the Caribbean were prepared for a clash of fleets. None were prepared for nature's most ruthless weapon. Within days, that invisible threat would bear down on them, rewriting not only the fate of the islands, but the course of an entire war. After devastating Barbados, the hurricane pressed onward, striking the islands of St. Lucia and Martinique with unrelenting force. On St. Lucia, entire plantations were flattened, and the island's landscape was stripped bare as trees, crops, and buildings were ripped apart. Ships anchored in harbors were torn from their moorings and smashed against the shore. The French colony of Martinique fared little better, with the town of Saint-Pierre suffering catastrophic losses as homes collapsed and flooding swept through its streets. From there, the hurricane moved through the eastern Caribbean, cutting across the small island of St. Vincent and heavily damaging Grenada. On St. Eustatius, a bustling Dutch trading hub, warehouses filled with goods were reduced to rubble, and dozens of merchant ships were destroyed. Throughout these islands, survivors described the wind as deafening and constant, with gusts so powerful that even stone buildings were toppled. The hurricane then curved northwest toward Puerto Rico and the eastern tip of Hispaniola, lashing coastal settlements before continuing toward Bermuda. The destruction left in its wake was unlike anything recorded in the region before. Not only were communities physically shattered, but vital trade networks were crippled, leaving many islands without supplies for weeks. In the span of only a few days, the Great Hurricane of 1780 had transformed thriving colonial ports into disaster zones, altering the course of life across the Caribbean. The Great Hurricane of 1780 was not just a force of nature, it was a human catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Across the Caribbean, tens of thousands of people lost their lives, with estimates ranging between 22,000 and 28,000 fatalities. Entire families and communities were wiped out in moments, leaving survivors grappling with profound loss and devastation. The island's strategic importance during the American Revolutionary War meant that many soldiers and sailors were caught in the storm's deadly grip. Warships from the British, French, and Spanish fleets suffered catastrophic damage or were lost at sea. The British Royal Navy, long considered the world's most powerful maritime force, endured severe losses. Warships like the HMS Phoenix and HMS Andromeda were sunk or destroyed. The mighty HMS Thunderer, a 74-gun ship of the line, sank with all hands in the stormy Atlantic. French naval forces were similarly devastated. Transport ships carrying thousands of soldiers were lost off Martinique, drowning approximately 4,000 troops being moved for the ongoing war effort. The storm made no distinction between allies and enemies, striking indiscriminately at men, ships, and fortifications alike. With so many experienced sailors and soldiers gone, naval operations were severely hampered for months afterward. The losses delayed planned offensives and forced commanders to rethink their strategies. The Caribbean fleets were left crippled, reshaping the balance of power during a critical phase of the conflict. Beyond the military toll, the storm left behind a humanitarian crisis, with survivors facing starvation, disease, and homelessness in the ruined colonial towns. In the months following the Great Hurricane of 1780, the Caribbean was a region transformed not just physically but strategically. The British Royal Navy, weakened by the storm's destruction and loss of experienced crews, found itself on the defensive. Repairing ships and replacing sailors took time the British simply did not have, delaying critical naval operations during the American Revolutionary War. French Admiral de Grasse, learning from the devastating risks of staying in the hurricane-ravaged Caribbean during the season, made a bold strategic decision. In the summer of 1781, he led the French fleet north to the Virginia coast, avoiding the dangerous hurricane zones. This move proved decisive. At the Chesapeake Bay, de Grasse's fleet established naval dominance. The British fleet, still recovering from the previous year's losses and operating with fewer ships and men, was unable to break the French blockade. This set the stage for the siege of Yorktown. American and French forces, led by George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau, capitalized on the naval blockade. Trapped between land and sea, the British general, Lord Cornwallis, was forced to surrender his army on October 19, 1781. This surrender effectively ended major combat in the Revolutionary War, ensuring American independence. The Great Hurricane of 1780 was more than a natural disaster. It was a pivotal moment that reshaped naval power and altered the outcome of a war that birthed a nation. It reminds us how history is influenced not only by human actions, but by the uncontrollable forces of nature, whose silent hand can change the fate of empires and peoples alike.